I'm going to be talking about Witold Lutosławski's Concerto for Cello and Orchestra. It was composed between 1969 and 1970 for the Royal Philharmonic Society in London, but dedicated to famous cellist Mstislav Rostropovich. There are differing opinions on whether the concerto holds programmatic meaning or not. In letters to Rostropovich, Lutosławski expressed that there was a narrative of conflict between the cello and the orchestra, but Rostropovich took that a step further and applied it to a political idea of one individual fighting against the masses or against the oppressive state. Others interpreted the conflict between the cello and the orchestra as a musician or intellectual struggling for their voice to be heard in an orthodox culture, which parallels postmodern ideals. I read about a conversation between Lutosławski and Rostropovich about the coda, the final movement, where the cello becomes dominant over the orchestra, and Rostropovich took that to mean that it was winning, that the cello was winning over the orchestra. While Lutosławski's concept did include victory, he did not intend that in a political realm. Ultimately, the meaning of the piece is up for interpretation, but Lutosławski did confirm that he did not intend to have any explicit programmatic meaning in the piece. The orchestration includes 3 flutes, including piccolo, 3 oboes, 3 clarinets, including bass clarinet, 3 bassoons, including contrabassoon, 4 horns, 3 trumpets, 3 trombones, tuba, timpani, 3 battery percussion parts, which include bass drum, orchestral bells, suspended cymbals, small cymbals, snare drum, tam-tam, tenor drum, tambourine, tom-toms, vibraphone, whip and clapper, xylophone, and then there's piano, celesta, harp, and strings. I wanted to take a second to mention the roles of some of these groups to be aware of before I get into the score. The brass, and particularly the trumpets, play especially important roles because they mark beginnings of each event of conflict or interruption between the cello solo and the orchestra. They act as, again, as interruption points, and I'm going to talk about that when we get into the score. The strings kind of blend the roles between the cello and the orchestra, taking on both conflicting and supportive roles. Since the strings are able to match the timbre of the cello, obviously, because the cello is a string instrument, they take on a more supportive role than the brass, for instance. Okay, the form. The piece is divided into 4 movements. The first is a 4-minute introduction of just solo cello, which functions kind of like a cadenza and explores the repetition of a single note, open D, which I will get into greater detail when we look at the score. The second movement is called 4 episodes, which are 4 repeated events defined by a specific orchestration, and in almost all 4 cases, a repeated motive. The second case is a little bit different because it doesn't include the same motivic elements as the first, third, and fourth episodes, but the orchestration is the same. So you can kind of, it's debatable whether or not that counts, but that's kind of how that's divided. The third movement is called the cantilena, which utilizes a string-heavy orchestration. A cantilena is defined as a lyrical or vocal melody intrinsic to specifically instrumental music as opposed to vocal music. And I think the orchestration choice of having only strings really supported the lyricism of the cello solo, especially since the timbres match. The cantilena then transitions into a finale with a unison gesture between all of the strings in the solo, leading to a texture idiomatic of sound mass, involving orchestration blocks of sound, so different groups blocked together, and they overpower or dominate the solo cello. So this is the point where Rostropovich kind of took this to mean that the masses or the big oppressive group is winning for a second, and then the cello then becomes victorious at the end. This piece ends with the cello finishing strongly as the orchestra fades out and ends on a repeated note, an A5. And this is similar to the introduction, only it's in the soprano range of the instrument, and we have long tones instead of short iterations of a repeated note, like in the introduction. There's also a theory that between the introduction and the finale, we go from a repeated D to a repeated A, and that it ends on a half cadence in that way. So that's something to consider. And although there are clear sections outlined, the movements are connected as a whole. And there are moments of connectivity between all four movements that do provide thematic unity. So the cello does link those movements using motivic devices. So the movements aren't specifically named like cantilena, finale, etc., but there are intended differences between those moments. I also wanted to take a second to talk about some of the really important compositional techniques used in this piece. Lutosławski is known for his use of aleatory and aleatoric counterpoint, which he started using in 1961 with the composition of Venetian Games. Excuse me. His use of aleatory is controlled, and in that he specifically notates pitches and rhythms within a cell or within a grouping of some sort, without indicating a specified metered endpoint. So in the case of Venetian Games, he used ad libitum, which would give the conductor, just the conductor would mark the stopping points where the part wouldn't. An aleatoric counterpoint is what occurs when those multiple parts individually playing these aleatoric cells come together vertically. The interaction of the parts vertically creates the counterpoint naturally because there is no indicated vertical alignment between those things that their interaction then creates that counterpoint. So the control comes horizontally, where each instrument has a specific indicated part, but the aleatory then comes from the vertical misalignment of those parts. These moments often create harmonic aggregates to give the impression of a triad or some other harmony without specific vertical alignment. And in the case of the concerto, he'll use a lot of tetrachords or hexachords, things like that. Another interesting thing to point out is that the cello part and the string parts in the third movement employ the use of quarter tones, which required Rostropovich and the string section to use altered fingerings. So now I'm going to go to the score. Okay. So this is the beginning of the introduction, and there are a few motives I'm going to point out. So this is the repeated D figure, and it's marked as indifferent. So he's really not making a big deal out of this opening gesture here. He just wants the repetition really to be prominent. And the grouping is interesting because it's 1/16th note plus a quarter note. So it's kind of almost feeling the pulse in subdivisions of 5 rather than 4. Thought that was interesting, which then links to this little 5 grouping. So this is then really what the pulse is indicated as, is this group of 5 that then becomes important later. And then this grouping of closely related quarter tones. So this is all really within, a semitone, which is interesting. And when you listen to it, it doesn't really sound the difference isn't really that small because they're so close to each other, which is interesting. And then we have this motive again. So really what's happening is that this repetition is then being elaborated upon until it happens again. This glissando motive also comes back because it's being used as like a lament or a sort of moaning, which can be used as like a response to the conflict that we know that the cello is going to experience. And then this is also repetition followed by harmonics, again, coming back to this repeated open D. This is also an expansion of the quarter tone grouping. So this is the 4 that we saw earlier, however, followed or preceded by a dotted 16th note. So elongating that comes back. And then just more material, more small iterations of quarter tones. Coming back to this repetition, indifferent, again, indicated. Except this time it's much longer. So we're experiencing elongation and then embellishments on this. So this gettato that we see is just the same iteration, just with more notes. I guess is the easiest way to explain that. And then harmonics. So then these harmonics are using the A series to then come back to D. So it's kind of like a harmonic derivation for a second from D. And this could also be seen as a precursor to the A that we're going to see in the last bar of the whole concerto. So that's, maybe I'm reading too far into that, but that's also something to keep in mind. So now we have brass interruptions, and this becomes very important because these are basically like roadblocks, or not roadblocks, but just points of interruption that then pave the way for the other parts to follow. So the cello has been playing for about 4 minutes now. And then we have the single note of just trumpet. And the trumpet in particular is important because anytime that this happens, except for I think once with the trombones, the trumpets are there. So there are other brass that come in or add to this later, but the trumpets are always a part of that. So in this, we have a repeated note, and then the cellist again continues with this undulating open D, and then the one part repeating that. So then we have now repetition. This page is a transition into the second movement, where we have individual trumpet parts. So up here, we had the first trumpet, and then the third, and then the second, basically outlining sort of what the tetrachord over here is. So we've got a C sharp, an E flat, and an A flat, and over here we have the addition of A natural. So this is kind of the idea that I was getting into with aleatoric counterpoint, in that they're starting in specifically indicated spots, and they're supposed to follow a tempo and a rhythm, and, you know, of course, pitch values. But there's this arbitrary rest in between each of these repetitions, and the ending spot is not indicated. So that's up to the conductor. And this vertical alignment, of course, this is going to change based on how they interpret this rest later on. But that is basically what is going to create the counterpoint between everything in this tetrachord. Okay. And then same thing, the cello then drops out, and then we have a hexachord of just more notes. So we have an expansion on the pitch content we had up here. Okay, and then we end with the trumpets. So this is now the start of the second movement, and we have just a different orchestration, but before, I'm actually going to play the music for the first movement in a second, but I wanted to just point out an orchestration change. So we now have the addition of the harp and the clarinet. And in this case, we have cello. It doesn't always come back, but the harp and the clarinet are what is going to announce each of these 4 episodes with the cellist. And I'll get more into that after I play the music for the first movement, but that's just something to keep in mind. Okay. Okay, so that's the first movement. That's just to give you an idea of some of those orchestrational things in there. So in this, the 4 episodes, what's important is obviously the episodes, and in particular, the orchestration. So if we're looking at this cello part, we have open pizzicatos, similar to the opening with these isolated incidents, but obviously with changing notes. So this E here is just the mark of the new movement. And then this D, we see that the harp is then going to basically dovetail off of these notes. So we see that the cello has a D, and then the harp is going to play the same pizzicato. Well, obviously the harp only plucks, but D, and then continue this gesture. So the harp has an extra note. So with all of these pizzicati, and then the second time it happens, the harp continues that, and then the clarinet continues what the harp was going off of. So basically, it's just gestural continuation, which is really interesting. So this happens, this texture with this dovetailing happens 3 times. The second episode, which I'm not entirely convinced I have right, is basically orchestration. It's another moment of harp, solo, cello, and clarinet. So it's kind of debatable, but this orchestration happens clearly like this, where they're taking over this role off of each other, happens 3 times. So we have a new motive also. We have this 8th note, 16th note gesture, which happens in this movement pretty frequently. Each movement basically adds new motives while also, maintaining the motives from the introduction. So yeah, like I mentioned, they're converging from one pitch. That's how these episodic moments are constructed. More of this motive. And when the strings enter, so in the opening, the cello had pizzicato. When the strings enter, they are also continuing that role with this aleatoric pizzicato figure, sort of like the trumpet interruption, but obviously due to orchestration and due to the nature of the instrument and the nature of pizzicato, it's going to be a lot less abrasive. And then we see another trumpet interruption, but we're seeing this in the percussion rather than the trumpet specifically. So more moments like these, I mislabeled that for sure, but more moments like these, but belonging to different instrument groups rather than just the trumpet. And obviously not quite as announcing as the trumpet was. So this is just moments of similar contrapunctal moments, but not as interrupting as the trumpet was. Okay, so then we have continuation of this trumpet plus all of this, percussion, wow. And along with all of the pizzicato. So what that does is basically pizzicato, we can categorize that as percussive. In addition to the actual percussion, we're kind of making this really articulate texture. That's what's happening. So this is now what I categorized as the second episode. And the reason why I'm not convinced is because the texture is not the same. We have clarinet and bass clarinet, and we have harp, and we have cello, but the texture is not quite the same. But it does kind of go away from this percussive texture that we had the few pages before. But the other thing that's interesting is that the clarinet and the bass clarinet dovetail off of each other. The harp is kind of continuing the 16th note gesture. So it is continuation, but not in the same way as the other episodes. Okay. An interesting thing this movement has is the alternation between really quick alternation of minor thirds. In this case, in particular, it's major, but everywhere else in this movement, you'll see really rapid switches between major and minor thirds. Again, more of these. This is more obvious than it was the first page. So now in this interruption, we have the addition of trombone. So we have the first two trumpets, but now we have the addition of that lower voice and the brass. Similar rhythm as the opening interruption, but the intervals are inverted. So instead of having sixths, like in the individual parts, we have the trumpet has now a third, or in this case, a sixth. So it's just similar material, different intervals, and this continues. So this episode is much more obvious. This is the third episode between the clarinet, the harp, and the solo cello. The notes are different, but we have the pizzicato, and we have this continuation of material. So these pitches are the same. The harp continues this gesture. The clarinet continues what the harp was doing, etc. So this is really evidently an episode where the other one wasn't as clear. And then we add piano to this. So the piano is kind of then continuing. So we have the pizzicato continued by the harp, which is continued by the clarinet, and then continued by the piano. So we just have this long, not necessarily staggered entrances because they're all starting together, but they end differently. They're continuations on each other. More thirds. And now we see winds. So this is kind of the first time we see all, or at least most of the winds, woodwinds in particular. And they just have kind of undulating figures that start and stop at different points, but it is metered. So we are not counting this as aleatoric counterpoint, but it is just kind of coming in and out of itself, this gesture. So it's really connected, I think is a good word to use. Same thing here, starting and stopping at different points, but connected, similar to the gesture from the episodes. More thirds, more of that, and then some moments of unity between all of those parts. Now we have the strings, the cello, or sorry, the piano, the celesta, the winds, etc. More similar stuff, more vertical unity, which is interesting. And then more thirds. This is just kind of the cello is embellishing those motives there. So now we kind of are seeing the full woodwind, at least the woodwind section here, using the similar concept, as I mentioned before, of continuation on each other's figures. That's what this page is doing. Same thing here. And then we kind of have another, for a second, another trombone interruption. So the trombone is by itself, which is different from what the trumpets, the group of trumpets were doing. And then a few pages earlier, the trumpets and the trombone. So now we have a sole voice, which is similar to that sole trumpet voice from the beginning. And then just a group of trombones. So he's changing the orchestration here, but with a similar goal in mind. And then at this point, we have alternating entrances and staggered thirds. So then the orchestra is now taking on the role that the cello was having. And we see that in the full woodwind section without oboe emceeing. More percussive accompaniment. Feathered beaming. This is interesting because this is an aleatoric device, which implies, this is the first time this happens, which implies increase or decrease in subdivision speed, I guess. So that's kind of the goal here. Not necessarily, I guess in this case, it could be aleatoric counterpoint since they're all using the feather beaming and using this continuation here. But this is just an interesting aleatoric device I wanted to point out. The cello has these glisses, which become important more in the later movements. Basically just indicating moaning or lamenting. So the cello is, according to Rostropovich, in this fight with the masses, or this political battle, external, internal, whatever. According to Lutosławski, it's just conflict. So that's just an interesting narrative device there. And then we see another trumpet interruption. So this is the full trumpet section again, back to the beginning. And this is the final episode. So there's only one Pitts, really. It's not multiple events of this, but the gesture of continuation is basically maximized, where we have two full beats, I guess, or two full groupings of continuation on this pizzicato, and the harp and the clarinet stop at the same time. So this is just a different way of expanding the same gesture. And then we do have more moments of unity between all of the parts. So it is like, and then we're including celesta and bass clarinet. So overall, he's just expanding the episodic goal here. And then more of the flute, clarinet gesture from, and this we do see continuation. So this is dovetailing into that, etc., which was different from the start of this episode. And then everyone kind of comes back in. We see more of this, similar to what the feathered beaming was earlier, but now we have mostly in time. This isn't metered per se. And I mean, we do have some indication of time, but now it's all in time without the beaming like that. Okay. And then this is the last trumpet interruption of the movement, unless I'm wrong, in which case that would be awkward, with kind of more elongated rhythms. And this is just a shorter interruption here. And then we have this closing of this really fast repeated thirds. So this is kind of different from how it was presented earlier. And then we have a trombone interruption to finish out this movement. And we also see two trumpets and two trombones. So it's kind of a mixed brass texture there. And that's how the movement finishes. So I'm going to go back and we're going to listen to it. But then this is, just to be aware, the same material as the opening. This is the open D, and it's indicated indifferent. So this is the same there. But it's transitioning into the third movement. That's what this material is being used for. It's being used to close off this episodic stuff, and especially to close off this interruption here. And then to start the beginning of the cantilena. So I'm going to go back here. Okay. Okay, so that's the second movement. The third movement is really pretty, first of all, but it involves strings predominantly, which is important. So we have this 5-note figure and pizzicato. So pizzicato becomes important, especially on this note E. E becomes an arrival point for pizzicato sections, and C becomes an arrival point we see down here for arco sections. Here we have staggered entrances going from bottom orchestration up. So we start with double basses, they have staggered entrances. So this leads to an additive texture, and then the cello, and then so on and so forth, the violas, the second violins, the first violins. But before I go on, we have this new motive with descending minor seconds. So we have this grace note figure, which is also important, with whole steps. And that kind of gets transferred into different ranges here. So like the jumps between each of these individual successions of seconds kind of changes, and then it ascends. The strings, interestingly, have augmentations of this quarter tone grouping that the cello had in the introduction. And then we see more of this grace note figure. So as this quarter tone figure is developing, the cellist and the strings are kind of developing different material, but the timbres are kind of complementary. As we continue, we see an augmentation of this quarter tone grouping, and then this motive, this grace note motive, instead of descending, is now ascending. The parts alternate. So where the first violins start, or segment of violins start, another group kind of dovetails off of that, which is interesting. So it's kind of splitting the section a little bit. We see this motive from the second movement of this 16th figure. Kind of more similar material here. More dovetailing into each other, as I mentioned a few pages earlier. Same here. Same here. And then the winds and keys come in. So this is new and interesting. Using similar motives, again, we see this, but now it's dotted 8th note, dotted 8th note 16th figure. Similar there. We kind of are taking this idea of the repeated note from the introduction and elongating it. So we're both embellishing the undulating indifferent Ds that we had in the introduction, but now we're in a much higher range and just continuing to embellish that. So this is then gets faster, changes octaves, but the note ultimately is the same. Okay. And then we have a continuation of this quarter tone grouping. The winds drop out, so we no longer have as full of a texture as we did up here. And then just this really long crescendo. I really like how this was written out. In all of the strings, so we kind of have more unified alignment. I mean, obviously we don't. We see some of these crossing each other, I guess, but they're working towards a global or unified point here. So as they crescendo, the cellist comes back here to this repeated E. So this is, not a pizzicato section like I mentioned earlier, but E becomes this arrival point. The strings, however, all end on this G sharp, and it becomes a drone. And then the cellist eventually, the cellist does not play the G sharp, but what happens is the descending motive comes back, and then, finally we do end on this G sharp all together, all the strings, including the soloist. Then everybody plays the same unison theme together. So this is a moment of cooperation, whereas in other movements we had moments of conflict, moments of interruption. This texture is finally and only here all together and all unified between the cellist and the rest of the ensemble, or in this case, the strings, because obviously no one else is playing, which is interesting. We see cooperation for the first time and for the only time. So that's an interesting point. And then there's a cell of this repeated grace note motive into finale. So this is the one and only time we have tutti orchestration. So everybody is playing here on this fortissimo, super sound mass type texture here. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to the third movement so we can hear that, and then we will continue. Go on. And that's the start of the finale. So we have, I'm going to go through this quickly just because it's like 30 pages long, but we have lots of block orchestrations. So I kind of categorize some of these groups into different blocks because of that. We have this tutti brass. So we can count this as an interruption because the strings were playing solo for a second. And then finally, all the brass, not just the trumpets or the trombones, but all of the brass come in with this aleatoric figure that matches the interruptions from the opening. And then at this point, the solo drops out. So the solo is kind of leaving room, or maybe not leaving room per se, but the solo is dropping out to give the orchestra the opportunity to dominate the texture. And this, according to Lutosławski, is a sense of victory, obviously not political, but the orchestra for a second in this moment is dominating, is winning, is whatever word whoever interprets this wants to use, over the cello. So this is contrasting this cooperation we had. Everyone was playing together. Everyone was supporting the cello. And in this case, that completely goes away. And then from this, we have the similar motive of these interruption figures, but in the winds and in the piano. So the piano actually becomes important in the next few pages because we have a cluster, but I'm going to talk about that when we get there. The strings come back, same figure. So really we're taking the trumpet interruption motive, that whenever that happens, and giving it to everyone. So this is the ultimate interruption, the ultimate victory, I guess. Again, tutti brass, aha. So here we have a piano cluster for the first time. I assume just arms over all the keys, because there's no way you could get all of those ranges if not for that. And then lots of unified things after this. So the strings then come in with a unison pizzicato, sort of unison startings, obviously, because you can't really, or he's at least not using the staggered entrances as in the beginning. We have a more pointillistic texture here from the battery percussion and from the piano. And then here we go again, everybody comes back in. We have constant eighth note groupings here. They're not all the same, but it's basically alternations between 2 and 3, 3 and 2, 2, 3, 3, 3, 2, 2, etc. to create this. And this basically becomes the rhythmic motive finishing here off. And the reason that is because when everyone is playing in homorhythm, which happens officially in a few pages, it's a really strong textural moment, especially for sound mass and someone like Lutosławski. So here, this is all kind of not really aligned, but at least they're all playing constant eighth notes to some extent. Here, at this moment, we do have proper homorhythm, and it is metered. So he is specifically indicating, and this is constant 16th notes, my mistake. He is indicating specifically that he wants homorhythm, specifically that he wants some sort of domination here. And then we see the return of the cello solo. So basically the orchestra is going to have these moments of homorhythm, and then the cello is going to try to interject back in, try to take over. So tutti wins, homorhythm. And then the cello is coming back with these groupings, but using double stops. And this, in my opinion, kind of mimics the ritornello form. Obviously, that's probably not what he intended. But just having the alternation between the Vivaldian idea of orchestra solo, it's kind of what's going on here. Tutti wins, more of the same groupings, and these are shorter iterations of that. So we've got shorter distance between each of these conversational elements between the cello and the orchestra here. And then we have percussion. So this is important because it is highlighting the cello and supporting the cello as an additive instrument rather than conflicting with the cello. We have a return of these quarter tone groupings much faster than they were in the introduction. So the cello is kind of really taking off with that motive here. Flute is additive. The rhythms are similar, not as fast. These are, I think, I can't see. No, the rhythms are complementary to what the cello is doing. Temporarily, the flute is additive to the texture rather than conflicting to the texture. Similar idea here. The piano then has this 2, 3, and then 4 gesture from the homorhythm section, more tutti winds. So the reason why this is important is because the auxiliary instruments, the percussion, the piano, and the solo are leaving room for this interruption. So this is kind of back to that ritornello solo idea, but then we have these additive instruments in support of that. So the space is important because instruments that are supposedly supposed to be conflicting this are now leaving space, are now supporting this instead of supporting the orchestra. Okay, moving on. We have a return of this motive, this extended note with the quarter note groupings. We have that. We have, again, tutti winds over here, just more really fast groupings. The cello is basically becoming a lot more frantic, a lot more urgent. So different groups, this is again, more block orchestration, are coming in to interrupt. And you could say also additive and supporting, or sorry, adding to and supporting the cello also, because the rhythms are similar to what the flute was doing a few pages earlier. So now we have double stops, and they're pretty heavy. So at this point, the cello is really loud, the cello is really urgent, as I mentioned. And this is kind of now, the cello is taking on the role of the interrupter. As it gets further and further in the movement, the orchestra kind of fizzles out a little bit, like the iterations become shorter, become less intense, and the cello then takes on that role. So this trombone interruption, we have glisses, which kind of mimic what the cello was doing. So we kind of see a role reversal here, which is interesting. And I say miniature just because it's really not as loud. We see a decrescendo to piano pretty much immediately. And because the cello is still really dominating the texture, whereas the brass is using similar interruptory motives, just not nearly as loud. And then we have the same thing with the, percussion, mimicking the cellist percussive texture. The glissando comes back. This is important because all of the strings are also mimicking this. So the strings are kind of using this idea of expansion and diminution, both literally and figuratively. So the glissandi here, we can see they're converging to a point or converging from a point, which is interesting. So that's also a lamentation technique that he was using, which is interesting. This harp thing is from the second movement, which is interesting. So he's kind of bringing back all of these motives from before. Here we have space again. So now we're really seeing this cello versus the orchestra, one versus the many. We see this really intense texture and then a single or two notes in this case between the full orchestra, allowing for space for that. Cellist continues. More vertical iterations of that. Return of the homorhythm, so that's important. This interruption is less intense. We see one trumpet on a long tone converging to this homorhythm point. So really the orchestra is just, what am I trying to say? The orchestra is losing control. And this space here, I say it's delayed because if we're going by this interruptory rule that we were using before, the space should have occurred right when the orchestra started playing, but the cello is then converging in on that space, which is interesting. And this is more isolated homorhythm. So instead of having groupings, we have just a single note. And this is really similar to the intro, this repeated note figure, because each part individually has a single note, but instead of being in a subdivision of 5, we're in a subdivision of 6. So this is just an expansion of that, which is interesting. And also a role reversal in addition to that. We see more glisses here. This is the climax because this is the final moment where the orchestra has control. This is the final moment where the orchestra, and it says tuta forza in every part, is seen as dominant here. So, and then the exits are terraced, sort of like how everybody was dropping out in the episodes. And then we see this lamentation motive again with all of these repeated glissandi, gradually dropping out. So I say retrograde of the entrances in the movement 3 because in movement 3, the double basses, then cellists, then violists, then violinists, etc., entered, and they're exiting in the opposite direction. So the violin first, then the viola, then the cello, etc. So that was an interesting point to bring up. And then the strings just make a final statement, but at pianissimo. So this really isn't like an interruption, it's just music. That continues that. The orchestra appears again. It's really not controlled. It's not homorhythmic. They're kind of just all entering in at their own time and then converging to this arrival point, this single note of arrival in all of the parts. And then the strings fade out, again, staggered exits. And then the last page. So the cellist reaches this really high note. We have A5 and stays on this A5 for the remainder of the piece. And the reason why this is important is because it is mirroring the introduction, mirroring that repeated figure that the cello had at the beginning. But this time on, if we're perceiving the beginning in D, we're now ending on the dominant or ending on like a question mark or a half cadence or something like that. And the beginning started piano, but we're ending fortissimo here. So this is also just one big long crescendo if we're thinking of it like that. So that's interesting. I'm gonna go back to the beginning so we can finish it off. And there we have it. That's the Lutosławski Cello Concerto.